You look weary. Come closer. I am the teller. Tales of wonder. Tales of light and dark. There are all manner of stories here. So come, sit by the fire. Let me tell you a story. Hello, and welcome. Around the fire this week, we have two tales. The first, the Rainbow Bridge. What do we do when we face the idea of our own mortality? And better yet, what do we do when we must tell our children about the path we must all take at the closing of our own chapters? In our first story, one man will have to face this challenge. I present the Rainbow Bridge.
John sat in his car, the engine idle, its gentle, unassisted revs gently vibrating the seat. He stared straight ahead, out of the front windscreen, at his home. He'd been sat here for half an hour now, unwilling and unable to go inside. Luckily, it was late in the evening, so Tom, his son, was likely already asleep, so he would only have to give the bad news to his wife, Sarah, that an hour ago, after a long battle with cancer and other ailments, their beloved pet dog, Drax, had been put to sleep. He had lived a long life, a good one, too. John had rescued him from a shelter aged 5 that was well over 10 years ago now. Drax had been the precursor responsibility test before he and Sarah had taken the leap and pursued having children, which actually ended up occurring a mere year later after one too many champers at his brother's wedding and virile excitement overtaking their usually careful consideration of contraception. As such, Tom had grown up alongside Drax, two friends aging and playing alongside one another. Before their son was born, John and Sarah had worried about how their dog might react. The year they spent alone with Drax in the house, the dog had very much become attached to the pair, constantly seeking attention in the mornings and spending the evenings sandwiched between them on the sofa. They had often read and heard stories of pets, especially dogs, becoming troublesome when kids were introduced into the household, especially dogs that had been neglected prior to their new ownership. They needn't have worried, however. The day John and Sarah brought home their newly born son, Drax essentially forgot all about them. He was by Tom's side the second he entered the house. He would sleep on the floor by Tom's cot, and as he grew older, eventually ended up sleeping alongside his new tiny friend every night. As the years passed and Tom became a person, he spent every waking moment with Drax, out in the garden playing football, taking him for strolls around the surrounding streets and parks. He wouldn't even introduce Drax as his dog to his friends and strangers. He would simply say, "This is Drax, my best friend." Tom thought that he and Drax would be friends forever. He didn't notice as the years went by that Drax seemed to be getting slower and slower and sleep longer and longer until a month ago, whilst on a walk, Drax had a fit and collapsed. That was the first of the many vet trips John had to take Drax to over the past 4 weeks. John wasn't too concerned at first. By all accounts, Drax should have a good few years left. He wasn't on his last legs after all. Christ, he could still outrun many a younger dog down the park on the weekends. But with every trip made to the vet, the news from the vet grew more troubling, and the voice delivering it became more and more quiet and sensitive. When finally, a mere 2 hours ago, as John sat in the waiting room, sweaty palms rubbing frictionless against one another, the vet informed him that his son's best friend's very existence was pain, and the most humane thing to do would be to put him down. John was shocked, heartbroken. Not so much for himself, of course. He loved this dog. He was part of the family. But he was beside himself as how to tell his son. He decided against calling Sarah and getting her to bring Tom to the vet to see his friend off from this world. He was a bright and caring child, but he was only 10. In John's mind, he wouldn't be able to handle watching the life slip from his lifelong companion's eyes. So John did it alone. He waited alongside Drax, gently stroking his decade-long companion, and ushered him from this world into the next. Drax never made a sound, yet John watched his eyes dart around the room for a while before he passed. He wondered if he was looking for Tom. He wondered if he had made a mistake. A gentle knocking at the passenger side window shook John from his cascading thoughts and regrets. Sarah stood looking at him, wrapped in her dressing gown. She didn't need to ask what was wrong or what had happened. She could see on her husband's face, and the noticeable lack of excited scratching at the back window, that Drax had not made the return journey to their home. She opened the passenger side door and got in, and as she shut the door, her eyes and mouth opened, tears and sobs of grief flowing in equal measure. John held his wife close to him, his own eyes releasing its own river of salted sadness. They remained in this locked state of communal grief for a while, each the other's rock, until Sarah pulled herself upright and wiped her puffy red cheeks clear of the evidence of her sadness. "What are we going to tell Tom?" she said, utterly without her own answer to the question. John shook his head in bewilderment. They had been lucky in recent years regarding bereavement. Both their parents were all still alive and living happily, and there had been no deaths in their close or extended families or friends. Until this night, their house had been untouched by the inevitability of mortality. They did not subscribe to any particular faith or spiritual frame of thinking, and as such, had never even discussed the idea of what happens when life ends to their son. Both Tom and Sarah had their own separate ideals and belief in this area, but that did not filter into their day-to-day lives, thoughts, or actions. "He's still awake. He's been waiting up in his room for you to get back," Sarah said, still looking at her husband. John took a long, deep breath and considered a wealth of options and roads he could take. "Come on. We best head in or he'll come out and wonder why Drax isn't here," John said. Sarah nodded, taking a breath. John held her hand tight and squeezed it with the urgency and firmness of a comfort forged from perseverance. They got out of the car and headed into their home. John stopped as he closed the front door and looked up at the stairs leading to his son's bedroom. Sarah turned to him. "Shall we do it together?" John shook his head. "No, I'll do it. I was there. I'll explain." Sarah nodded and kissed her husband softly. Her lips tasted like her earlier expelled tears, and that made Tom fight back another onslaught of his own. Sarah walked down the hall and into the kitchen, and out of sight. Tom walked up his stairs, each step he took coupled with a deep sigh full of sadness and wonderment. What was he going to say? As he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped at the collage of family photographs Sarah and Tom had made for his birthday last year. Snapshots of memories and better times all meshed and collided with one another to create a single image of their lives. Out of this happy maelstrom of static images, one drew John's attention. Tom and Drax running across a green and open field. In the sky above them, a rainbow, clear and colourful against the deep blue of the spring sky. John looked upon this picture and suddenly he knew. He knew what he could say. Deep through the fog of his mind, a memory dislodged itself. A half-hazy conversation he had had with his own father some 20 years previously. Buoyed with a newly found sense of focus and comfort, John steadied himself and knocked on his son's bedroom door. "Come in!" Tom shouted. John opened the door and entered. Tom bounded down off his bed. He was small for his age, made up for it with the energy of two boys his age. He wrapped his arms around his father and hugged him tightly. "Hi, Dad! Missed you!" "And I missed you, Drax!" Tom shouted as he looked around and behind his father for his best friend. He was usually not far behind. John felt the dam in his chest fit to birth, but clamped down. He crouched down as to be level with his son. "Hey, Tom, why don't we sit down? I need to talk to you about something." Tom nodded and sat down on his bed, still craning to look around his father for Drax. John turned to close the door. Don't close it, Dad. Drax got to come in. This is his room too, Tom giggled. John sighed as he closed the door and returned to the crouching position in front of his son. Well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to talk to you about Drax. Tom nodded slowly, now sensing something wasn't right. His father looked troubled. His eyes were red like they were after he watched that film about the baseball field and the ghost dad. Is he okay? Tom asked, kicking his little legs against the bed in a rhythmic attempt at easing his growing anxiety. Well, no. You know, Dad's been taking him to the dog doctor the past few weeks because he was feeling poorly. Tom nodded, legs kicking a little harder now. Well, when I was there tonight, the dog doctor said that Drax was so poorly there was only one way for him to feel better, and there was only one place that would make him feel better. Tom nodded again. Hugs from his best friend? John's heart broke once more, but he held fast. Normally that would be the best way, but Drax was too poorly for that. Drax had to go be with other dogs in a place just for dogs poorly like him. He had to go across the Rainbow Bridge. Tom turned his nose up in confusion. What's the Rainbow Bridge? John stood up from the crouching position now and sat down next to his son, placing an arm around his shoulder. The Rainbow Bridge is a wonderful place. It's where people and pets and everyone you love goes when they're too poorly. It's a huge and open field, long winding rivers. Everything that's beautiful in the world is there, and everyone is happy. And when you go to the Rainbow Bridge, you wait for everyone you love to come join you. And when everyone you love is ready and have all arrived, you all cross together and get to live there forever, happy. Tom sat and considered what his father had said. So Drax isn't coming home? Does he not want to live here anymore? Did I upset him? Was it because I accidentally stood on his tail the other day? John held his son and turned his small face towards him. Listen to me, Tommy. Drax loves you. You're his best friend. But we don't get to choose when we cross the Rainbow Bridge. Everyone gets their time. And they go, and they wait. And he'll be there when it's your turn to cross the Rainbow Bridge. Do you understand? Tom nodded slightly. Does that mean you'll be there too? And Mum? John nodded. Yes, but we won't be there for a long time, son. It's not our time yet, but we'll be there. Everyone you love will, I promise. Tom nodded again and looked at his empty bed behind him, the small impression in the duvet covers where Drax used to sleep, looking noticeably more absent. He turned back to his father. Dad? Yes, son. If I have kids like you and Mum had me, will I wait for them at the Rainbow Bridge? John smiled, somewhat relieved that his son seemed to be accepting this sad news with ease and aplomb. Yes, they will. You'll be waiting there for them, with me and Mum, and Drax. Tom seemed confused. But doesn't that mean we'll always be waiting? John creased his brow and he wondered. What do you mean? Tom looked up at his father. If we don't cross the Rainbow Bridge until everyone we love arrives, won't we be waiting forever? My kids will want to wait for theirs, and then their kids, and then theirs. Will we ever get to cross? Or do we have to wait on the bridge forever and never go to the other side where it's beautiful? John stuttered and attempted to think of a response. He could find none. Instead, he kissed his son on the top of the head and told him his mum would be up shortly to say goodnight. Tom watched his father leave, swearing he could hear him crying. As the door shut, Tom looked at the end of the bed he had shared with his best friend up until tonight. He laid down next to that absent spot, running his hand across the phantom space that once had been a panting and furry friend. He closed his eyes and pictured Drax stood atop a vast and colourful bridge. But he couldn't see it. No matter how hard he tried, all he could see was the darkness of his own closed eyelids.
Our second tale delves into the lives of people we often come into contact with, but sadly show little respect to. In this tale, we go into the day-to-day life of a chef. May I present Burnt Out.
Chris woke at exactly 5:45 a.m. like he always did, minutes before his alarm was due to go off. A few weeks ago he had tried to set the alarm 15 minutes later to go off at 6:15, so that he might get the chance to wake up at 6 a.m. when he needed to, but it didn't work. There he would wake slap bang at 5:45 a.m. As he stretched his arms and massaged his tense and damaged shoulder, his mind immediately turned to the prep list he had written last night waiting for him, like it always did. He was regretting the decision to not pre-dice the onions and carrots for the base for the sweet potato and button-up squash soup he had to make for lunch service the night before. It would now add an extra 30 minutes to the prep time. If any of the team were late this morning, it would be cutting it fine for the soup to be ready in time for service. He pushed this thought from his mind as he reached out to touch his partner Georgia next to him. She wasn't there. She had already left an hour before whilst Chris was still asleep. She had to be at the hospital at 5:30 exactly to do the 3-hour cleaning shift before hustling across town to carry on her studies at the local college. He checked her bedside table, and there it was. Her leather-bound folder crammed with the copious amounts of notes and essays she had written for her Senko childcare presentation this morning at 11 a.m. He'd have to shoot her a message to remind her to stop at home before heading out for the day. Chris stood up and made his way out of the bedroom, collecting the small pile of neatly folded clothes by the door as he did. It was the same white t-shirt and blue jeans he had been wearing all week. There was no need to clean or wash them, however. The only time they were worn on his body throughout the day was the half an hour of commute to work, the half an hour break he got between double shifts, and the half-hour commute home. As he pulled on the t-shirt, as he made his way into the bathroom, he took a sniff of the shirt. It had the smell of aged potatoes and fat from the 50-litre deep-fat fryer he stood in front of 14 hours a day. Today will be the last day before it was sent through the wash, he thought. Switching on the overhead light above the mirror in the small bathroom, Chris blinked heavily and repeatedly as to open his eyes. As the cheap light bulb flickered into life, he caught a sight of himself in the mirror. He should really shower before going to work today. His hair was thinning and brittle, haphazardly splayed around his head, whilst his short beard seemed to have shrunk even further, pushed underneath his chin as if it was consuming itself. Grabbing a toothbrush and a hairbrush, he set about cleaning and brushing. He looked at the eyes staring back at him in the mirror, bloodshot from the 8 tins of Budweiser he drank after stumbling home at 11 p.m. last night. The shift had run over due to a last-minute table of 10 looking for burgers and beer after a 5k bike ride. Foolishly, he had sent Joe, his sous chef, and Steve, his pot washer, home early, since the rest of the shift had been so dead. Subsequently, he had to do it all himself. Burgers on the grill, chips in the fryer, plate up and service. Then, re-clean the surfaces and tools used for cooking. Sweep the floor one more time because of the crud that fell from the chopping board. Take out the basically empty bins due to the pest problem in the dry storage area. Then mop. By the time he had finished and locked up, he had missed the 9:50 bus back to town, and the next one wasn't until 10:35. Luckily for him, he always kept a crate of the Kings in his locker, and the evening temperature was still warm enough for him to sit out on the village green for 45 minutes and drink himself straight. Unfortunately, he was feeling it now, though. He finished both forms of brushing and admired himself in the mirror. His eyes were still as red as anything, but at least his breath was fresh, and the beard and hair had been manoeuvred enough to be considered halfway presentable. He gave himself a smile in the mirror and pointed dramatically at himself. Turning away from the mirror, he switched the light off and headed down the stairs. As he got to the last few steps, he could already hear Geezer, he and George's 2-year-old West Highland Terrier, scratching the other side of the lounge door. He had recently been transferred from the cage in the kitchen into the lounge at night time after they had finally been gifted a dishwasher by George's parents. Their reasoning for the gift being that way they didn't have to look at a dirty sink whenever they came over. The pair had accepted the gift through gritted teeth and painted-on smiles. Chris opened the door and Geezer trotted out and immediately ran up the stairs. Despite it always being Chris to open the door for him in the mornings, the dog would always desperately search for Georgia upstairs first, before half-heartedly coming back down to Chris for a stroke and some attention. Chris went into the kitchen and began putting on the rest of his clothes. As he squeezed himself into his jeans, Geezer appeared and made a beeline for the back door. Whining, he looked from the door to Chris. Chris checked the time on his cracked phone screen. 6:13 a.m. 27 minutes until his bus. 10 minutes walk from the house up the hill to the bus stop. He could afford the dog a couple of minutes of garden time before he waits for George's mum to arrive and walk him at 10 a.m. Go on then, don't say I didn't do anything for you, Chris says as he unlocks the door. The second it opens, Geezer is out the door in a flash at the top end of the garden in a matter of seconds. Chris laughs as he returns to the counter and begins rolling his daily cigarettes. He had promised Georgia they would both cut down. He was a die-hard 20-a-day smoker when they first met. But recently, after the death of her father, she'd become a lot more concerned with their health. She had wanted them to stop completely. They had compromised at Chris giving up weed and cutting cigarettes down to 10 a day, and Georgia subsequently giving up cigarettes and only smoking 2 joints in the evenings after work and college study had both been completed. He had often wondered if she had stuck to her part of the deal. Her car did still smell like stale smoke whenever he got in it, but hey, who was he to police her? He had a secret pouch of tobacco at work anyway. Finishing rolling the 10 for the day, he placed them in the small wooden box his friend Simon, a joiner, had made for his 23rd birthday last month, and shoved it in his rucksack. Turning, he leant down to the washing machine and pulled out his black t-shirt, black trousers and white bandana. They were still a little damp. He hadn't pulled them out and hung them up to dry the night before. No matter. As soon as he set up the kitchen this morning, the heat from the char grill, salamander, hobs, fryer and the pass would soon dry them out. Packing them away in his bag, he pulled out his 2-litre plastic water bottle. Moving to the sink, he removed last night's washing up so it didn't block the path of the water from the tap and filled it up. He looked out the window and watched Geezer running around in circles in the garden as he did. That's right, Chris thought. Get rid of them beans. Turning off the tap, he screwed the cap back on the bottle and placed it in the rucksack. Zipping it closed, he whistled loudly as he shoved his feet into his well-worn trainers and grabbed his leather jacket and hoodie from the coat hanger on the kitchen wall. He whistled again after noticing the lack of dog feet click-clacking on the tiled kitchen floor. He pulled on the black hoodie and then the leather jacket and stepped to the back door. Come on, Geezer, I've got to go. Geezer appeared at the door, tail wagging and tongue lolling out of his mouth. Chris gave him a quick and brisk pat on his rear. Geezer loved a stiff pat. Heading for the front door, Chris grabbed a handful of dog biscuits from the small plastic tub that sat on the edge of the counter by the blender and teased Geezer with it so he would follow. Reaching the lounge door, he tossed the biscuits in and Geezer jumped in after. Chris closed the door behind him and opened the front door. Be good, Geezer, Chris shouted as he stepped out into the early morning sunlight and closed the door behind him. The bus stop from the town to the village where the pub was situated was a 10-minute walk up Elizabeth Drive, a long steep hill with a long section of detached houses lining it all the way up. Chris always had to hold off a cigarette on this walk, as halfway through the cig and the walk, he would be clutching his side, holding back a stitch, and would lose at least 3 minutes of walking time. He had gotten the walk down to a fine science. Down and out of the street he and Georgia lived on, and out onto Elizabeth Road took 2 minutes. Then 6 minutes to traverse the hill, with 2 minutes to spare to wait for the bus and catch his breath. As he walked, he thought of the day ahead. Now, it was the head chef Sean's day off, so that meant he would be in charge of the team today. He hadn't wanted this position of power. But after 6 months of him joining the staff of the Lion Inn as a prep chef, the rest of the team that made up the chef de partie and the 2 sous chefs had all left for greener pastures. The position had fallen to him. That meant for the past 18 months, Chris had been in charge of the pub kitchen for a minimum of 3 days a week, while Sean was on his days off. This meant opening the kitchen up, turning on the main gas lines and ventilation systems, putting the pot wash section back together, lighting a minimum of 3 hobs, 1 salamander, 1 Merry Chef oven, and 1 small fryer for the breakfast service for the rooms that were provided above the pub. Maybe double that amount if any of the cottages available to rent were currently occupied, but he wouldn't find that out until he arrived in half an hour. They were self-catered cottages, but they had the option of choosing whether to turn up for breakfast on the fly between 7:30 and 9 a.m. during the designated breakfast hours. This could mean anything from an elderly couple looking for fruit and yogurt, and maybe a poached egg on toast if they were feeling adventurous, to 20 stag party attendants looking for full English breakfast with additions and subtractions. Whilst doing this, Chris would have to check the close down of last night, make any notes of things missed. Then stock levels for the days would be checked. This would mean checking the levels of prepared food as well as raw ingredients for the entire menu and any specials they had on. He would have to check the starters, mains and dessert fridges, the walk-in fridge and freezer and the dry storage cupboard. Anything that was low but manageable would be added to the prep list for in-between lunch and dinner service. Anything out, or basically out, would be prepped in time between breakfast and lunch service. Usually Joe or one of the kids would be in around 9 AM to help with the prep, and Steve on Potwash would follow at 9:30 for the cleaning jobs that needed to be completed. Over the course of the next few hours, deliveries would trickle in. Usually the baker first at 8 AM, which Chris would attend to, as to not allow anything to go stale. Then the fishmonger, followed closely by the butcher. Chris would direct either Steve or one of the part-time staff to put everything away with careful stock rotation and day dotting, as to not use new produce over old. He would usually have to double-check their work later on, but that was part of the gig. Normally the dry goods from the wholesalers would arrive anywhere between 9 AM and 2 PM, slap bang in the middle of lunch service. At around 11:30 AM, if the prep and cleaning was done, he would venture out into the pub to discuss with whoever was running the bar and service that day, usually the manager, Rebecca, or if Chris was lucky, assistant manager, Margaret. He would give them an itemised breakdown of the specials on offer that day, their ingredients, the way they were prepared and cooked, as well as the total amount of each special they had that day. Then he would grab 2 jugs from the bar, fill one with soda water and one with whatever local ale was on tap that day to make batter for the fish and chips, which were incredibly popular among the village residents. When that was done, he would advise his team of who was on which station and have them set up their respective stations. Chris would usually take the main section and stick Joe on the pass to plate and send out food. Starters would fall to whichever part-timer was around to do so, as it was so easy a child could run it. He would turn on the back right hob of 9 and instruct Steve to bring him a large pot full of water in which veg would be blanched for various dishes. Then the charcoal would be lit. This usually took at least 5 minutes on each side, as no matter how many times it was repaired, the pilot light on both sides took a lot of effort to keep lit. Then the 50-litre fish fryer would be turned on, any residual detritus that floated on the surface of the oil from last night would be removed, and any extra oil added from the massive 10-litre drums they had stacked in the dry storage. Then he would set up the mains section. The mains section was made up of the aforementioned char grill on the right-hand side by the pass. In the centre, a 9-ring burner with overhead salamander grill above it. Built into the hob was a large gas oven, but was only ever used on Sundays to hot hold roast potatoes, so it remained off the other 6 days. Instead, its door handle was used as a place to store a spray bottle with an olive oil mix inside. To the left of the hob, the 50-litre deep-fat fryer. Tucked between the fryer and the wall was a small, thin metal table. On that would sit a tub of flour, a tub of the freshly made batter. Below it, on a small built-in shelf, would sit extra oil in a plastic bottle, balsamic vinegar, red and white cooking wine, and a small cling-film tub of gluten-free flour for the celiac fish lovers. Behind this section against a wall was the mains fridge. It was split into 3 sections, each with 2 fridge doors each. On the left section in the top drawer, it housed various cooking ingredients and garnishes. Butter, sea salt, cracked black pepper, fresh thyme, parsley, rosemary, cheddar cheese and Stilton slices for burgers. Below that was the burger drawer. Lined in a large plastic tub and cling-filmed was the handmade beef burgers from Lee's Butchers in the town. They usually stored at least 50 in the fridge drawer during the weekday service, with a backup of 100 in the walk-in fridge. During the weekends it was 100 in the main drawer and a backup of 250 in the walk-in fridge. In the second section, the top fridge housed the veg for the main dishes. Green peas, asparagus, tender stem broccoli, cabbage, red and green, chantenay carrots and kale. In the fridge drawer below this one was the raw meats. In 3 separate and lidded plastic containers housed chicken breast for Hunter's Chicken and chicken burgers, sausages for breakfast, sausage sandwiches and sausage and mash, and gammon slices for gammon, egg and chips. This drawer required the most care, as none could contaminate the other at any time, so strict lid control was in effect. In the third and final section closest to the wall, the top fridge drawer contained sauces and dry pastas. At the back there was béarnaise and peppercorn for steaks, roasted red pepper and mushroom for salmon en croûte, fresh pesto for the pasta, then gluten-free and regular penne in separate tubs, of course. Below this drawer was the raw fish drawer. It always housed cod, the fish of choice for fish and chips, usually around 100 in the week and 200 on the weekends. Then a smaller amount of salmon for the en croûtes, then a space for whatever fish special was on, usually sea bass, tuna steak or mussels, perhaps the occasional bream, if it was on offer. On top of the fridges was a work surface with 3 coloured chopping boards resting on top of wet dishcloths for stability. There was a yellow for cooked meats, blue for raw fish, and red for raw meat. To the right of this was the Merry Chef ovens, a peculiar machine, a mix between a microwave and a conventional oven. It provided efficient cooking and quick turnaround times and had become a godsend for Chris and the rest of the staff during the busy summer period. Downside was, they were a bitch to clean. Once he was finished setting up, it was usually 11:50, which gave him and his team 10 minutes to take out the stuffed bins from prep waste and head down the back alley for a cigarette by the bin sheds. Rebecca had removed all the chairs that used to be down there under the statement, "You should save comfort for breaks, not cigarettes." So they usually took turns sitting on spare oil drums. After 10 minutes of smoking and idle chit-chat, they would head back into the kitchen. Usually there would be already a reel of paper tickets spurting out of the machine on the pass and on the main section, despite repeated instructions to wait until 12 p.m, so customers didn't feel like they were waiting too long for their deep-fried squid or bruschetta. Then service would begin. Usually they would run a 3-person team Monday to Thursday, one on mains, one on starters and the pass, and then a pot washer cleaning and doing the occasional dessert. This increased to 4 on a Friday, 6 on a Saturday, and 9 on a Sunday. Lunch service varied in business day to day. You could have a manic Monday filled with non-stop orders from 12 till close at 3 p.m, and then the next day have a total of 15 covers for the whole service. If it got too busy when 3 were on, then Chris would share the pass duties with whoever was on starters, and they would trade back and forth for whoever had more on their respective section. This would last the entirety of the lunch service. Then, regardless of how busy it was, Chris would need to start checking stock levels for bread orders from the bakery and wholesalers for frozen and dry goods. The bakers stopped taking orders at 3 p.m, wholesalers stopped at 3:30 p.m. It would often take Chris the whole hour to check these levels, while whoever else was on finished service and carried on the close down. He would take the worn and taped together leather order book and go through the dry storage cupboard at the back of the kitchen. This small room housed all the kitchen's dry goods. This included, but was not limited to, gravy granules, baked beans, chickpeas, flours, sugars, cereals, pasta, rice, tinned fruit, chocolate and toffee sauces, nacho crisps, olives, olive oil, balsamic vinegar, white wine vinegar, malt vinegar, meringue, icing sugar, cling film, tin foil, balsamic glaze, rosquito peppers, and others. Then he would check the walk-in freezer and fridge. The freezer stored boxed chips, vegan burgers, veggie burgers, ice cream, sticky toffee puddings, brownies, gluten-free bread rolls, the bakers didn't make them, garlic bread and any cheap special meat that Becky had been sweet-talked into buying by the wholesaler's agent Amy. The fridge housed fresh meat, fresh fish, vegetables, soup bases, milk, cream, cheese, sour cream, creme fraiche, salad leaves, cooked meats, and a large stock pot filled with veg cuttings for the weekend's gravy for roasts. After checking these, he would stroll down to the bin shed and, while sneaking a cigarette, check the cleaning cupboards for any low stock. This included dish towels, blue roll, dishwasher salt, disinfectant, antibacterial soap, spray bottles for both, dish soap, broom heads, bin bags, and mop heads. Once satisfied, he would do a walk-by check of the final orders going out at 3 p.m, then exit the kitchen into the pub, walk around the back of the bar into the small office. It was usually empty, so he would sit down on the rickety stool in front of the old computer, and whilst dialing the wholesaler's number from memory, text through the bread order on his mobile phone. Whilst on hold, he would begin writing a potential meat, fish and veg order for tomorrow from memory. None of them were needed until latest at 10 p.m. that evening, but he always liked to get a jump on it during his 10-minute waiting period on hold. It saved him time and stress later, trying to make the early bus home. When Amy, the wholesaler agent, finally connects to the line, he reels off his order as quick as possible, and politely declines her gentle prods and hints at purchasing whatever dead stock they are trying to get rid of that day. Then it's back to the kitchen for a final walkthrough inspection of the clean and close down. Usually Steve would try to hide a number of late returned dishes or a stubbornly burnt pan in a full sink of water, so he would need to harangue him into finishing. After that, he sent the staff on their 2-hour breaks, reminding them to write down any potential prep that needed to be doing on the list before leaving. After they had all left, he'll check all their fridges anyway for correct storage, day dots and coverings. If Joe was on, he never had to worry. If it was part-timers, there was always something. He would update the prep list if needed, and if absolutely necessary, prep any of the smaller, easy items then and there for half an hour, so they didn't get caught out later in the evening. Then he would go get changed and grab himself half an hour, or an hour if he was lucky, to himself. He'd go to the bar, grab a Coke, or a cheeky pint if Libby, the locals, and Chris's favourite barmaid was working, and then sit in the sun on the furthest bench from the pub. He would sit for as long as he could, smoke between 3 to 5 cigarettes depending on his stress levels. If George's classes had finished by the time he was off, they would have a phone call or a video chat and vent for a while about their respective days. If she was busy, Chris would either listen to music or just sit and admire the quiet beauty of the village green. Then it would be time to return. He'd head into the bar and stick a black coffee on the coffee machine. As it was prepared, he would head into the kitchen, turn the equipment back on and the extractor fans up, refamiliarise himself with the prep list, then retrieve his coffee from the bar. Then it was back down to the bin sheds for the coffee and cigarette, roughly between 5 and 5:15 p.m. Once he was finished, he would get changed and get into the kitchen. He would prep what would need prepping, and repeat the earlier setup process in half the time. Dinner service would run as usual, normally busier than lunch but with more spaced out covers. As the service would come to a close, he would wash down every surface with soap and hot water, wipe off the water with a squeegee, and spray them down with antibacterial spray. Then the surfaces were blue rolled. Old and off stock would be thrown in the food waste bins, and the bins were then weighed, and the weights noted in the food waste book. A new prep list would be written, and he would touch up and finalise the veg, meat and fish orders, and go to the office one more time, bring them through to their respective company, while whoever was on would finish the bins, sweeping and mopping. When he was done, it was roughly 9:25. 25 minutes after service had finished and 15 minutes before the early bus. He would quickly but efficiently check everyone's fridges and stations, and then shut down the gas, lights, and leave the extractor on low. Whoever was closing the pub would turn it off when they locked up the building. He'd then finish the last bit of mopping and send everyone else to get changed. By the time he was finished and they were out of the changing room, he would ditch the dirty mop water down the drain, get changed, return the mop bucket, and lock the kitchen from the outside. Then a short hustle over to the bus stop, cigarette while he waited, back on the bus to town. Once he was back in town, down the long hill he would walk, and back into the house just in time to eat dinner with Georgia and spend a measly hour of time together before they both collapsed in exhaustion by 11 p.m. This is how a regular day should go. How he was told it would go by Rebecca the manager and Sean the head chef. But it rarely went that way. In fact, Chris had lost count of the times it had ever gone that way. It had been so few and far between. So as Chris reached the top of the hill that morning and thought about everything that was facing him that day, he reached into his rucksack for a sip of water for his dry, parched throat. When he realised, he had forgotten his knives.
And so, the fire dies. We will return in a fortnight, as we always do. Be sure to look up the rest of the Come Sit By the Fire, a short story podcast, tales. The fire continually burns on many platforms: SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Be sure to journey over to WORK.STORIES.REPEAT.com for more stories, articles, and essays. Fire also burns on social medias, the digital fireplace that is Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll see you again by the fire. Farewell.